I have been given the honor today to introduce my very good friend, Jenny Yang, and the former chair of the EEOC. I run into Jenny often at different events. I saw her most recently in Washington, D.C. at an Urban Institute event talking about AI. I ran into her in Cambridge. We also run into some of our other friends from back in the day, Dick Griffin and David Weil and Jennifer Abruzzo, and we're always like sitting around drinking coffee like the government in exile, right? So there's always a very government in exile feeling to what we're doing. And we always talk about the glory days and remember when we were pushing the envelope and we were doing all this wonderful stuff, and look what's happening now, tisk, tisk, tisk. And there really is a government in exile kind of feel to it. But Jenny Yang does not live in the past. Jenny Yang always lives moving forward. And she's always thinking. She's somebody with just a tremendous amount of energy and creativity. And just really as an example that really segues into what we're doing today, the whole issue of the use of big data screens and the use of big data sets to either further opportunity or to undermine opportunity was really, in my mind, really first put on the table in a very systematic way when Jenny was the chair at the EEOC, and she organized, as part of the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, a commission meeting that would look at these issues. And we held 3 different meetings that looked at issues of big data, and I was completely, as a litigator, unfamiliar with these issues, as I think were most of the practitioners back in 2014. They weren't really thinking about it. I think the use of big data screens and artificial intelligence and the whole concept of algorithmic justice was something that had not really been spoken about extensively. And I really think through those meetings and through the publicity generated by those meetings, I think that it really triggered a conversation in the labor and employment bar, certainly in academia, and I straddle both, on these issues. So that is really an example of who Jenny Yang is. Now, at the EEOC, I transported from the Department of Justice the sort of notion of the code of the road, right? And that is what happens on the road stays on the road. And I'm always like, when I introduce people that I work with, and Jenny and I traveled all over the country together, I'm always like, don't breach the code of the road. Whatever you do, don't breach the code of the road. What happens on the road. But I'm gonna breach it a little bit, and not with really even a funny story, right? Jenny is one of the most passionate, committed civil rights lawyers I met. So when we would get together and get over, sit down over a couple of drinks, right, and over dinner and second glass of wine, we would often talk about disparate impact and business necessity. And because Jenny is so curious about these issues and is always really trying to push them forward. She was a tremendous leader at the EEOC. Currently, she wears many hats, but I think the one that we're waving is the Senior Policy Fellow at the Urban Institute. And she's launched an initiative on employment equity to apply evidence-based practices to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion at work. She's really been very aggressive in terms of pushing the Urban Institute and organizing a national conversation on the issues she will talk about today. So it is with a tremendous amount of honor that I introduce the Honorable Jenny R. Yang, my friend.
Thank you so much, David. It makes me feel like I'm back at the EEOC. David was our most popular moderator for all our EEOC events, so he is used to playing that role, and thanks so much for having me. As many of you know, Sam Estreicher was my law review note advisor when I was here at NYU. He was very generous with his time, and even though I was more plaintiff side focused, he agreed to work with me. And then I realized he was trying to get me to create a safe harbor for validating subjective hiring practices. So that was an eye-opening experience, but I learned a lot about validation, right? And it is so important. Oh, Sam's coming in now. I was just talking about him. So after leaving the EOC, these issues were something that I continued to be interested in. You know, I've been out of the government now for about a year and a half, and I keep getting these LinkedIn job advertisements for like automotive sales. Like there is a real pattern, and I'm like, why am I getting these? There's nothing about me that's ever had any experience in automotive anything. So I was very curious, and I was talking to someone at LinkedIn who does some of this, and she's like, well, it may be because your title of commissioner is so unusual that they don't have a lot of data or know what to do with that, right? But that is my own personal anecdotal example of why the algorithms that exist today, right? We can't really put our whole future in those hands because much of the work is still developing. So what I wanted to talk about today is both what the sort of the promise of technology, what it holds for us as a society, but also what we really need to be mindful as we make the policy choices today that will influence our future, our democracy, and our equity going forward. Because we know that technology is impacting our daily life in so many ways, and the workplace is one of them that has been, I would say, more under the radar than some of the others. But these choices really have staggering implications, right? And we talked on these panels over the last 2 days over the ways in which artificial intelligence, predictive analytics is being used within employment, right? There's both the advertising, who gets to see the jobs, there's the sourcing of candidates, how you're identifying your top candidates, there's the actual screening, what sort of job criteria are you screening for through these algorithms, and they really have become a new gatekeeper for economic opportunity. And it's easy to feel hopeful that technology will allow us to solve all these really difficult social problems, but it is important that we recognize the limitations of math, right? That's what these algorithms are doing, is using mathematical formulas, and they can only tell you so much. And so we really need to think about what it is that these screens can do and what they can't. So we know that, you know, part of the excitement around algorithmic screens that we talked about is because employers are being inundated with applications, they're looking for efficiency. I'd say that's probably the predominant motivation, right, is trying to hire more efficiently with less cost, less time. There are employers who are also looking affirmatively to try to use this technology to create a more equitable system, but they're not necessarily coextensive in how they're being used. So I was really excited just by a lot that I learned today, particularly some of the possibilities for learning from the banking and lending sector and the rulemaking in that space and how it might provide at least some comparisons for the employment space. So I want to thank everybody for really laying the groundwork for what I would like to share today. And the question that I would really like us to think about is how can we use technology to advance a more equitable future, right? Not just let's assume we can't do anything to stop this technology and let's try to do as little harm as possible with exacerbating bias, right? And I think that's sometimes how we approach the conversation. But what interests me about technology and some of these algorithmic screens is, might it be the vehicle to get employers to look more carefully at its existing selection process, at its existing performance evaluation process, and to recognize all the bias that currently exists in most systems, right? So the major challenge that algorithmic screening designers have in developing these tests is that employers often do not have good data about what is the job criteria that really is most predictive of success. And how do you collect that in a way that does not reinforce the bias of your current workforce? I mean, the historic biases that may have led to your current workforce, which may not be representative of the true talent in that field, right? So what excites me about technology is the possibility of that interest in using the technology to motivate employers to do some of that hard work. And it takes resources to really understand what is predictive of success in your job, and not just to rely on traditional criteria like elite universities, right? Social network hiring, right? Might we be able to disrupt our traditional hiring practices because a desire to use AI and other types of technology documents your decision making, right? In a way that subjective hiring practices are not documented. So, in terms of my background, I started out at the Department of Justice after David, and our main focus was challenging cognitive tests and physical abilities tests in police and fire departments, right? So we would be bringing these disparate impact cases, reviewing the math questions for a firefighter exam and trying to really demonstrate whether or not these issues were a business necessity. Were they closely related enough to a job, to what the firefighter was doing on the job to be a basis to exclude people from that job, right? And I think that entire field has a lot to offer this conversation, but often there is a lot of disconnect between the well-established field of validation, and as David and I were talking about just now, as well as over drinks, disparate impact law is really not that well developed, right? So David was a leader at the EEOC and really trying to think about how the agency could help further develop the law. So right now, we're operating in a space where there isn't always a clear understanding for employers, for vendors, about what disparate impact is, what business necessity is. So we have to think about how might we be able to provide some clarity as we're asking employers to make some of those hard decisions in their current workforce. So, there's a lot of research people have seen on sort of performance evaluations, right? Being subjective, not actually being correlated with performance. There's gender, racial disparities in performance evaluations. But if that is the basis on which you're identifying who are your top performers and then developing your selection device, right, you are relying on biased data as part of that process. I know Adam Klein has done a lot in that space looking at performance evaluations and big data. So I think that there's a real, but it doesn't mean you could never do performance evaluations effectively, right? There's research showing where you have much clearer criteria and a basis for evaluating people that's agreed upon and followed, that you can get more job-related decision-making. So I think my hope is that some of this interest might catalyze those conversations and the creation of better data within individual employers' workplaces as the starting point to really understand, okay, if we're selecting for certain qualifications, like what really should they be? How might we move beyond our traditional reliance on proxies for qualifications, like elite schools, to actually tap into a more diverse a more diverse applicant pool? And we had a witness at the EEOC's commission meeting talking about that, right? The ability of AI screens to actually help employers identify what are some of those skills and abilities, and maybe not experience and training, right, that will make you successful in the job. And one of those witnesses was talking about research showing that actually if you can screen for these skills and abilities and find people who could really excel. But if you're just looking for whether you had a specific training or experience, you could actually hire someone very mediocre, right, who just happened to have the opportunity to get a particular 6-week course or something. And if you're screening just for that, have you had that chance to do it before, you're actually excluding a large segment of the workforce who could actually be very good at that, at training. So David mentioned a meeting we recently had at the Urban Institute. It was the Urban Institute, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. And we work to apply evidence to develop solutions to some of our greatest societal challenges using both economics and policy research. And in celebrating our 50th anniversary, we brought together, it was called the Changemaker Forum, and we had knowledge labs, where we brought together people, including Pauline Kim and Kelly Trindle, David, and others in this room, to look at issues around artificial intelligence employment equity. And we recognize that so much of the problem is that there is not enough knowledge, right, in the legal community about how technology really works, or in the technology space about how you integrate the legal and policy concerns at the ground level as you're developing the algorithm. So we brought together this group to really think about how we might do that. And I wanted to share some of those reflections with you today, and I also wanted to kind of share some of the interesting, I guess, challenges ahead of us. I earlier today met with Meredith Broussard at NYU, and she is a computer scientist and journalist who recently wrote a book, Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. And she gave some interesting examples of how computers and computer scientists, right, because it's really people who are designing these programs that can bring bias into a situation. And one example that she talked about was a study, like an effort in about 2015 to identify what makes a good selfie. So this PhD student at the time, who's now the head of AI for Tesla, designed this study where he looked at likes of selfies as a proxy for what made a good selfie. And he didn't even realize that all the good selfies were young white women, because they got the most likes. And so it sort of illustrates that often your metrics, right, about what is good and what is high performing is influenced by various biased subjective judgments. And you may not actually even recognize that unless you have a procedure in place to be looking for that. We know also that there is a very significant underrepresentation of women and people of color in many of these data science, computer science fields, and that can exacerbate some of these problems, because if you don't understand the way that structural racism and the way the systems have been historically biased, it is very easy to reintroduce that bias in existing systems. So one of the efforts that was announced, or that was announced in March, that was talked about at our urban convening, is a new effort to create a public interest technologist. I don't know if you're all familiar with that, but over 20 universities had gotten together. It was sort of the Ford Foundation, New America, and the HP Foundation, because they recognized that there weren't enough technologists that understood law and policy. There weren't enough lawyers that understood technology, so they want to create a whole new field where it's interdisciplinary, right? Where technologists will learn, study sociology and law and other principles, and people who are in the social sciences will study technology. And they're drawing in many ways on public interest law, right? So in the 1970s, there was a real push to create public interest lawyers because they recognized that without that institutional support, there would not be people, lawyers, looking out for the public interest. And it is clear that technology companies are, motivated by what's in their interest, right? That's their shareholder interest, the company owner's interest. It is not what is best for society and the public interest. So I think this field is an emerging one. They're just starting, but they're looking for partners, within universities. They have like Stanford, MIT, Columbia, the CUNY schools are some of their founding partners in creating this. And what they're saying to these students is like, if you care about civil rights, if you care about criminal justice, you should care about technology, because these issues are being used across this space. And what we've seen in the criminal justice context, some of you may be familiar with the algorithmic risk assessments, there's been a huge backlash by the civil rights community to the use of some of these screens, even if they're allowing more people to be released early, because there also have been a lot of problems where these screens can reinforce discrimination. And one of the things we were talking about just sort of in between these sessions is that these models, right, give this aura of scientific authority to the decisions. And whether they can actually be credited with that kind of authority is the really scary part. Because often the models purport to do one thing and they may actually be doing another. So in addition to the example Pauline gave about the Amazon screen, around the same time, there was another resume screening company that was, I guess a company was looking to buy it, so it wanted to vet what it was really doing. And it found that the two traits that were most correlated with success were being named Jared and playing college lacrosse. Right? Both very heavily gender correlated and having no actual causal relationship to the work. And so when we know that, and that was like a company marketing that they were hiring the most, qualified people searching for it, and that took a third party to come in and find that problem. So I think when we met as sort of our Knowledge Lab, we came away with a few takeaways. One was that we really need to understand how all these different types of selection devices are working and what is the science and justification behind each of them, because they're all very different. We talked about the video interviews, right? And a lot of that science, I think, is highly questionable, in my view, that it is premised upon. And I think it's really important for us to be examining that before wholesale launching into it. I was hearing that NYU, just law school, has some video interviews for students. I think that's, a great test example there. There's data there to be looking at. But so there's so many different ways AI is being used at different parts of the process. We heard about the Facebook ads. There was evidence in this Upturn report, which was included in your materials, that showed just racial differences in the types of ads people saw. I think something like lumberjack or some job like that was disproportionately shown to whites. And then taxi driving was disproportionately shown to African Americans. So that is sort of that initial stage at which you can be using AI in a way that is discriminatory. And then when you start ranking candidates, right, so you're identifying who's the most qualified, right, that becomes a selection device. And one of the issues we litigated a lot in the cognitive space, cognitive test, is what's your cut score on the test, right? Because if you look at something like the SAT, if you're only hiring people in the 99th percentile or the very top because you have so many applicants, you're just trying to cut it down, actually it may be people in the top 20th percentile could actually perform this job well, but you've just excluded a huge percentage of people in an effort to just reduce your applicant pool, and now you've limited it in a way that's not job related. By limiting it to this very, very narrow segment of people at the very top, you can be excluding people who could do the job. So to give you another example, when we were at Justice, we litigated a case against the SEPTA Transit Police. And they had this running test where they required everybody, they were transit police, to run some really fast mile, I'm forgetting the exact amount. We found in discovery, because they left a social security number on, that they actually had used the average perpetrator rate based on track runners from the University of Maryland. Yet they still argued, right? This is the minimum level necessary of physical fitness to be a transit cop. Even though they had all these overweight cops who couldn't run that fast, they still argued that. And they won in the district court. The court found more's better. Well, why can't they try to aspire to be faster? Why shouldn't this be a selection criteria? So you're actually excluding most women who cannot meet that aerobic capacity, even though they could actually do the real job, right? We ended up winning on appeal where the Third Circuit said, your cut score needs to be the minimum level necessary to perform the job, right? You can't be creating these high, you can consider other factors after that screen, but you can't exclude people right off the bat who could do the job. And so that, I think, is another piece of this that we need to be understanding about the algorithmic screens, right? At what point is it cutting people out, and could they perhaps do the job, and who are you sorting and when? And those are important issues from a litigation standpoint. But I think that, coming from the EOC and really understanding how hard it is to bring these cases, I am really interested in exploring solutions that do not rely on individual plaintiffs to sue employers and vendors who have designed these tests, right? Because even at the EOC, like, we weren't getting that many charges. We did look at some issues in this space, other types of, algorithmic rating systems that could be biased, but individuals don't have that information. The EEOC can bring its own commissioner charges under Title VII, directed investigations, under other statutes, or on its own initiative without a charge. Like, we've done that on personality tests and other things, which often have a disparate impact on people with disabilities. So the agency can do that affirmatively, but it takes a huge amount of resources to analyze these cases. So that, I think, is not something that's going to be at the front burner of the EEOC's concerns. When I was at the EEOC and after our commission meetings, I would talk to our folks about, like, what would it actually take to update the uniform guidelines? And people looked at me in horror, like, don't even think of trying to do that, because it was such an undertaking, right, to get together and agree with Department of Labor, Department of Justice, OPM, to bring our standards in line. It was really a difficult thing to do, to try to think about updating it. So one of the things I had been interested in, as Kelly had mentioned, was thinking about, well, what could the EEOC do on its own, sort of sub-regulatory guidance to help people understand, well, this is at least how the EEOC thinks that you would apply the existing uniform guidelines to the innovations and developments we're seeing in technology. I think that the current EEOC, there's a new chair, Janet Dillon, who just joined mid-May, so they now have a quorum, but they've got a lot on their plate. They've got some equal pay issues they're working on. They've got to redo the wellness rules. So there's a lot of issues, and I don't see the EEOC acting in any kind of immediate way on these issues. They do have a new chief data scientist who has revamped the sort of data analytics capacity of the agency with a primary focus on using the agency's own data better. So they've announced that they'll be releasing the EEO1 data, which is broader demographic information that the agency has collected for over 50 years by race, gender, ethnicity, job category, that they'll be making that available in a de-identified way so that researchers and others can look at patterns and trends. So I think that there's interest, like, across the government in being better equipped to use AI for its own work, to do it more effectively, as well as to make its data available to the public. But I think that the concern I had when I was at the agency, and this was like 4 years ago now that we started looking at it, is that if we didn't act quickly, the field would evolve in a way that would be really hard to change if there wasn't clear guidance. So I think that one of the goals that I have at Urban, I'm developing this new employment equity initiative that David mentioned, is to think about how we can bring together technologists, those from the legal experience, and those like policymakers, journalists, others in this space that can think about what are the important policy choices we need to make. How do we encourage more meaningful transparency about what is happening? Because just making a lot of complicated things available to the public isn't necessarily going to bring accountability if people can't understand it. So some of the hopes I have in terms of moving forward are thinking about, what does an accountability framework look like? Could there be a system for third-party monitoring similar to in the credit scoring system? Because then you can protect, I think Pauline mentioned this as well, you can protect the confidentiality of the algorithms, but have a third party actually vetting the specific data that you have, ensuring there are incentives to keep and document all that decision making. So I think that there are important areas to explore in that space. In some ways, I've seen some parallels to equal pay, although you would think a pay analysis should be much easier than validating an algorithmic screen. Part of the challenge is because people didn't know what they were paid, the likelihood of a pay discrimination case was fairly low. So there wasn't always that incentive to do the pay audit and analyze it. And so there is an effort now, right? There's the UK reporting and there's more monitoring of these issues. So more employers are using various outside monitors to do a pay audit, but there aren't agreed upon standards on what a pay audit looks like. There's a lot of room for disagreement on how you compare different workers. And I think that in that space, we've seen state regulation where they are creating safe harbors, right? Allow some in Massachusetts, for example, allowing employers to try to adjust their efforts. So I think it could be interesting to also learn from some of the efforts in that space as we think about what are some viable policy solutions, as well as internal governance, right? There's ideas around something like a IRB, which researchers are used to having, right, where you're internally vetting your algorithm. At these tech developing companies, there are ideas around labeling, almost like either a nutrition label or a warning label, so that, HR managers or others who may think that this tool can do more than it does is actually like warned about what it can actually do. There's testing to make sure, vitamins, for example, actually can do all the things that they say, and that's like third-party monitoring. So I think there's a lot of room for both ensuring that the models themselves do what they say they're doing and to really understand that validation and to have a neutral arbiter that can help inform that discussion. So if any of you are interested in continuing that discussion, I would really look forward to hearing from you and to think about ways in which to move some of those ideas forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anyone have any questions?
Any questions or comments?
Okay, I'm off the hook.
Yes,
Thank
not.
you.
Thank you.